Hope you're all here. Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to this webcast, Continuous Monitoring, a Deeper Dive. My name is Dan French. I'm CEO at Consider Solutions. I'm joined by Steve Rooney, who's a practice leader in continuous monitoring here. We've been asked to do this, this session really to go to a little bit deeper level in some of the processes, techniques and best practices in continuous monitoring as we help finance functions drive towards world-class operational performance. Just in terms of housekeeping, you have a control panel on your desktop. We do welcome questions, so as you go through, do type out questions on that. We'll collect them at the end, and we'll endeavour to answer as many of those as we can. Those we can't answer today in the 45 minutes we have, we will respond to by email. So let's move on. Okay, in terms of introduction objectives, many of you have attended our continuous monitoring webcasts and presentations. So we're developing that conversation, getting to a level of detail. As I say, you asked us to get to the next level of detail. We also want to move beyond just looking at continuous monitoring of controls to thinking about how to monitor for risk and performance gaps. So you'll see that as we go through the specific examples. We're going to look at best practice techniques, and we're going to share some specific examples on how these analytics are developed. We're going to offer you some next steps. So at Consider Solutions, we work with organizations around the world, traditionally in Europe, but more and more now in North America, and we now have clients in South America and Asia as well. So it shows things are taking off in the continuous monitoring world. Before we get into the detail of the session, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that this whole continuous monitoring approach is really part of a strategy to become a world-class finance function. And many of our clients, I think, are well on that road to world-class finance. And if you take your benchmarks from Hackett Group or CIMA or from the CFO conferences, that's kind of classified as an organization that's starting to both raise its effectiveness but also drive efficiency down to where cost of finance is approaching 0.5% of revenue from perhaps 2 or 3% previously. So all the classic capabilities, classic activities in finance, both the stewardship and reporting, the back office accounting and operational activities, but more and more really good business partnering and management support to help business operations really drive an effective business. 4 pillars of financial management. I do like to keep referring to this. Efficiency and effectiveness clearly are very obvious. I think relevance and influence are really important and really drive the difference between world-class finance functions and those that are still aspiring there. And these are all about driving better information, better decision support, better analytics that decision makers need. And those analytics need to be both in the area of risk and in the area of performance. How do we drive optimal performance and how do we manage risk in our organization? And that really gives rise to a lot of discussion around these techniques of analytics, exception monitoring, continuous monitoring, and even continuous controls monitoring. So our agenda today is a little bit of introduction, which is me. We're going to talk a little bit about risk and control as we drive down this avenue. And then Steve's going to take over and really talk about the continuous monitoring program, tasks, the process itself, how do we deal with complexity, and go through some specific examples. And then we'll come back with critical success factors and some next steps. So before we start, it's worth bearing in mind that when we're looking at continuous monitoring, we're looking at finding exceptions, clearly. And as we're looking to get to world-class finance, we're looking at standardization and simplification. And obviously, we always strive to try and build that standardization into our processes, our policies, and our systems. But of course, we all know that in reality, you can't drive all the standardization that way. So if you use this, if you see this photograph on your screen, it's a wintertime entrance to a parking lot. In the middle of that little entrance driveway, you'll see the electronic barrier. And the electronic barrier really is our are controls and policies that try to drive us down a certain guardrails of processes, in this case through the road to the parking lot. But we also know there's situations where we either deliberately, inadvertently, or for whatever reason, avoid those standard policies and procedures, and those are the tire tracks. And in an effective world-class finance organization, you want to make sure those barriers are working well, and the barriers are all in the right places, but you also need to know, you need to monitor those tire tracks and what that tells us both about risk and performance gaps, and how do we standardize where appropriate, and how do we just recognize there's more barriers in our business than we expected. So when we think about that, we're thinking about, you know, how do we ensure our processes are standardized, but also how do we remain aware of those variants and how do we monitor for them. But the important thing to realize about continuous monitoring, and this reflects a conversation I had a week or so ago, although we're talking about monitoring activities and detail in our processes and our organizations, this is not about Big Brother. The fact is, over the past 15, 20 years, we're living in a much more complex and fast-moving business, and I don't mean that in a general kind of business school kind of way. I mean the fact that we've implemented global processes, global organizations, we've got integrated systems that span the world. And these days, very rarely does one person ever see the end-to-end process in detail. Very rarely do you actually see even a single instance in detail. What we shared services in different countries, with process owners, which might be regional or global, we're talking about a massive increase in complexity. And this is all about helping us get to standardization and helping us get to better operating efficiency. So mistakes, errors, and misunderstandings happen. Not always, most of the time, not for heinous reasons. Most of the time, people are trying to get the process executed as quickly as they possibly can. They're trying to achieve their targets. They're trying to serve the customer. They're trying to do all the right things. But that often leads to ways around the process. So identifying and understanding and diagnosing and improving our business processes by identifying what's not working, what those exceptions are, that's what management is about. So we're not trying to create a new management task here. What we're doing is providing information. And judgment, management judgment still matters. But what we're finding is informed judgment is a lot more valuable than judgment without the information. So fundamentally, exceptions to our business processes, they impact risk and performance. A lot of them impact performance because clearly standardization is a more economic way of operating. But those that affect cash or things of value or how we're perceived in the market or how we interact with our customers and suppliers drive significant risk as well. So fundamentally, what we're trying to establish is we know what is supposed to happen. We all have the chart on the wall of the processes. What we actually want to know is what really is happening on a day-to-day basis, and where is the delta between what is supposed to happen and what is happening. And it's that delta we need to analyze, understand, diagnose, and take action on to drive efficiency, better performance, and enhance risk management. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to hand over now to Steve Rooney, who's going to start talking to us about the continuous monitoring program. Steve.
Thank you, Dan. Hello, everybody. I'm going to start with an overview of our approach to the continuous monitoring program. Our strong belief is that the best way to start here is small and quickly getting a quick understanding of what's involved and the potential value. And our first step within this approach is what we call a quick scan. And the theme of the quick scan is very much on speed, do it quickly. Typically we look at 4 to 6 weeks, get some immediate value and get some learning and experience from that. The quick scan then can lead into a pathfinder, and the pathfinder is still very pragmatic in terms of use of process and technology. Still a limited set of things to monitor, a limited set of controls, limited set of analytics, I should say, and 1 or 2 business units. But what the Pathfinder helps to do is to establish the concept of a regular, continuous monitoring approach. From the Pathfinder, we'd then look to consolidate what we have. So consolidation is more focused on establishing a more sustainable and scalable platform for continuous monitoring. So again, using what we've learned in both the quick scan and the Pathfinder, but putting a bit more formality in place so that we've got a strong platform to then move forward into managed growth. So the managed growth phase is when we start to expand continuous monitoring beyond the initial relatively small set of areas that we're monitoring into a greater area and into business units across the organization. Key area to consider is who needs to be involved, who are the stakeholders, and where does the ownership lie. And this is essential to establish. Even if we've got the concepts in place, we've got the technology perhaps in place, the processes in place, that does not mean that the output and the results that come from the continuous monitoring activities will be reviewed and actioned. If that does not happen, then it's not going to add any value. The approach will be worthless. Typically, it would be different groups involved, both from central operations through to regions and local business units, shared service centers where relevant. I would say typically it's driven from the center, and some of the exceptions can be owned, reviewed and actioned centrally or regionally. But equally, depending on the exception, some of those will need to go out to the local business unit for deeper review and actioning. So it's important to understand the context of the exception, what's being monitored, and who are the most appropriate people to own the results and own the decisions and actions.
So that's good, Steve. So that's the ownership and stakeholders. What are the major classes of tasks we need to consider in continuous monitoring?
So in terms of tasks and activities, this gives us, the slide we can see now gives us at the top level what are the key activities related to a continuous monitoring program. And just to add a little more detail on each one of these, if we start at the top and cycle round. So first of all, content definition. So what do we need to monitor? What's important from a business perspective? What's relevant and what has the most significant impact? And what are the criteria for identifying those exceptions? And in the context of understanding the exceptions, we also need to understand the organizational landscape. We need to understand where that information is, what are the sources of that information, and any scenarios that need to be excluded. So we may have a generic exception, but there may be certain circumstances where that doesn't actually constitute an exception, and we'll talk a little more about that as we go through. So alongside defining the content, we also need to define the related processes. So how do we continuously gather the data that we need? How do we analyze that? And how do we distribute the results to the right communities within the organization across typically multiple locations, multiple regions, potentially across the world? How do we manage the technology that we're using to support the continuous monitoring approach? And finally, what's the process to review the exceptions within the business? And how do we make decisions, and what actions are potentially needed given the information that is being provided? Underpinning the content and the process definition, we need to establish a service that is providing the foundation to execute the monitoring. Now this can be technology which is installed in-house, connected directly to the information sources, but equally it could be something more of a software as a service, a cloud-based solution. So we need to identify what's most appropriate to support us in that respect. And then we move on to more of a business as usual, so execution. So on a regular basis, gathering the data, analyzing that, identifying exceptions, and having the right business communities reviewing and actioning, and deciding then what actions need to take place based on a good, deep understanding of what the exceptions are telling us and maybe any trends and patterns that may be significant there. Operational management, another key aspect, to oversee the whole process. So again, what we find is even if we have good content, good processes, the exceptions are being generated and distributed, doesn't necessarily mean that they will be actioned. Again, we need to drive ownership to achieve success. And many times that requires some level of facilitation to support the reviewers out in the regions, different locations, to help them initially understand what needs to be done and potentially what actions are required. So where are the areas of complexity as we get into a continuous monitoring approach? So in terms of the different areas that we may need to monitor, that information will reside in potentially many different data sources. And we'd be looking at things like transactions, master data, and process configuration data. Within that, and within the organization, need to understand the different dimensions in terms of different regional areas, maybe different accounting units, and other groups that are significant in this respect. And by significant, I mean in terms of an analysis unit, it's important to see dimensions across the different companies, across the different sales groups, and how do we distribute the results. So we need to think about units of analysis and units of distribution of the results such that they can be reviewed and actioned by the right people. On the other side, we have the different dimensions in terms of the process, and different applications such as different ERP systems, SAP and Oracle, for example, will implement the processes in different ways. And it's important to understand how those processes are executed in the application such that we can, again, define what's relevant in terms of the exceptions that we're monitoring for. So things like accounting document types, purchasing document types, different types of vendor, intercompany, external, and so on. We need to think about data gathering. So yes, we've identified the data sources. We understand where the data is, but how often do we need to gather that? Over what period? And do we need to accumulate data, accumulate a history, or do we need to extract that each time and overwrite what we already have? In terms of exception criteria, thinking through the conditions, so what specifically do we need to identify to know that the exception being reported is not a false negative, and it is accurate in terms of the identifying specific conditions with respect to that exception, and excluding anything which is okay in given scenarios. For the exception results, thinking about what's needed by the business reviewers. What do they need in terms of understanding the specific exception and the surrounding context such that they can make informed decisions, both at a detail and overview level. Thinking about the patterns that may be significant here, such that can then help them do their reviewing and making quality decisions based on the information provided. So how do we manage that complexity? What is significant in this respect? So as we said, the data sources, we have potentially have many data sources. So we need to have a good way of gathering data from those data sources and putting them into a schema that that we can use for a monitoring purpose, and being able to automate that process. That helps with the connection to those disparate data sources and helps manage the complexity in that respect. Then we need to analyze the data we've gathered. So being able to do that in a smart way in terms of defining rules which are not at a program code level, that are at a higher, more understandable level, and also having the means to parameterize some of those variables we discussed on the previous slide. the organizational variables, and the process variables. So we can define our exception criteria, but keep some of those variables separately, such that we can manage the content more easily. And again, automating that. Producing the exceptions in an actionable level of business, actionable business level details. So it's something that the business reviewers can understand. It's not too technical, and it gives the ability to do some contextual research. So yes, I can see the specific exception, but what's that related to? Are there any other trends or any other occurrences that may be significant here, so I can get a fuller understanding? So overviews and dashboard type approaches can help in this regard. And that also helps with the assessment and the decision making based on that.
So Steve, we've looked at some of the mechanics and the complexity, which clearly looks fairly significant the way you describe it. But what do we know, or how do we know what to monitor, what we're actually looking for? I guess it's pretty obvious if you have no idea what you're looking to monitor, you've got a big problem. I guess some of it must come from either the process or the stakeholder you have. So
yeah, good point. Yes, if you don't know what to monitor, then probably you need to go back. There won't be a clear business objective, so work that out first, and then start to work out what specifically is needed going forward. But in terms of inputs to that discussion, some key areas highlighted here. First of all, consultation with the finance leadership within the organisation, understanding their perspectives, areas where there are concerns already, where's there limited visibility, do we really know what's going on in that shared service centre, for example, do I need greater visibility to help with understanding there? Looking at industry benchmarks and best practice, for example, duplicate invoices and duplicate payments can have a significant impact on finances, 0.1 to 0.5% of annual payments potentially duplicates, and also what's needed from a regulation perspective, what must or must not happen to ensure compliance. And looking at that from a slightly different perspective, again, compliance, what do we need to do to ensure compliance to the regulations? What do we need to think about from a risk perspective, going back to Dan's earlier slides, and from a performance perspective, what can we monitor to help us continue to drive improvement?
yeah, and I think we're seeing a noticeable shift from a compliance focus towards more risk, a broader risk focus, and even a performance focus. And what's very interesting, and for those of you who attended previous presentations of ours, certainly observing that risk and performance are two sides of the same coin. So yes, we all have some compliance obligations, but the big value, the big payoff is in broader risk management and in driving out those performance gaps.
Here's some specific examples, some I guess what you call classic cases that most companies can identify with. And typically, these are the areas that many of our customers start with. And we're now going to take 3 of those and take a deeper dive through and discuss how you would define exception criteria and then potentially monitor these specific examples. So to start off with, we're looking at non-standard payment terms. In a nutshell, the impact typically is on cash flow, so cash going out sooner than it needs to, potentially. Maybe discount terms not optimal.
Oh, this is interesting, Steve. Information, the model of the information. I'm old enough to remember when this was fashionable first time around.
Well, so am I. So looking at this from, firstly, what information do we need if we are to, first of all, identify an exception where non-standard payment terms are being used? So at the top level, looking at what's on the purchase order, so any newly created purchase order, what are the payment terms that we're using, and comparing to what's been agreed with the vendor, which may be recorded against the vendor. But another level of complexity that comes in here is that each organizational unit within the company can have their own agreed payment terms. So it may be that we need to compare at the organizational unit level. So to identify the exception, we need to look at the purchase order, we need to look at the vendor, potentially we need to look at the organizational unit detail. And then we need to think through, so we've identified the exception, what other information does the reviewer need to have in front of them to understand the context and related information. So that could be the material being ordered, the price, maybe the material description, which maybe another item that could be on here is the material definition itself, details of the organizational unit, and if it's useful to know who created the purchase order, typically the purchase order will have maybe the ID of the person. We may also want to go off and get the person name. So thinking through what information is useful to provide to the reviewer such that they can fully understand this exception and the surrounding context. So at a very top level, the exception criteria for this particular example may look something like this. We're simply comparing the inequality of the payment terms on the purchase order to those on the vendor or the organizational units related to that vendor. And in terms of implementation, it may look something like this. So not implemented at a program code level, but abstracted to a higher level to help us more easily manage and define exceptions of this sort. So once we've got the exception and we have the related information, normally there's somewhat of an iterative cycle as the business reviewers start to understand what's been highlighted and start to explain, well, that's not really an exception because in certain cases, when we have special delivery conditions, we would not use the standard payment terms. Or perhaps we've got many of these purchase orders right now that do not tie up with the vendor payment terms. So let's focus on only those greater than a certain value. So exclude those less than a given value. So thinking through the scenarios that we want to exclude such that the exceptions being reported are significant, do have an impact, and are relevant to the reviewers, and essentially worthwhile spending time understanding. Okay, moving forward to another example, invoice quantity or value greater than goods received. So essentially the vendor's charging us more than they've actually delivered. Impacts here, excess payments, potentially excess inventory, and maybe inappropriate vendor behavior.
Steve, this is an interesting one. It's amazing how common this is in reality. What's the cause of that? Surely people have controls to stop this happening.
Yeah, that's true. Most, if not all, of the companies we're working with have a control, which is typically known as the three-way match control, which does checks on invoices, goods receipts, purchase orders to validate that the quantities values tie up. What we see, though, is that even though the control is in place many times, locally, typically this tends to be in local situations, the tolerance level on the three-way match can be outside what would normally be expected. We've seen examples of up to 20% tolerance, which means the vendor can deliver or can charge up to 20% more than they've delivered without any further questions asked.
I think that's stunning. I don't think I'd accept even 1% more than we'd ordered or received. But that's life.
Yeah, and this is it's life and it's reality. We're seeing this happening. So I think this emphasises the importance that even if a control is in place, monitoring what's actually happening in terms of the transactions, the tire tracks, as Dan talked about earlier, gives us the real situation. So again, another example of what information do we need. In this context, invoice greater than goods received. We're looking at, obviously, details of the goods receipts, details of the invoice, typically collected by purchase order line. So we're looking at what's been ordered. Maybe there are multiple invoices over time, multiple goods receipts over time. It may not be that they're all delivered or invoiced in one chunk. So here we need some kind of summary, and that's where our risk data model can help in terms of summarizing these points. So that's the information we need to identify the exception itself, and then again thinking through what other information is needed to present to the business reviewers, details of the vendors, details of the organizational units. What does the criteria look like? Again, simple example here. So summed by purchase order line is the invoice quantity greater than the goods receipt quantity, and we're only interested where the difference is greater than 5%. And implementation of that, again, could look something like this. Again, where we're using a summarization within the risk data model to help with the rule or analytic definition. One more example, and this time we're looking at duplicate invoices. So again, impact here, fairly obvious, excess payments, again, potentially inappropriate vendor behavior. But what constitutes a duplicate invoice? Obvious things are the amount. Is it the same amount? Is it the same vendor? Is it the same material? Is it the same period? Potentially, is it the same purchase order number? So first of all, identifying the criteria, which can identify a potentially duplicate, a potential duplicate invoice. So in that context, we just need the invoice and invoice line item, and then again thinking through what other information is needed to give the fuller context, vendor, org unit, material. And what may we exclude from here? So there will be some purchase order types that where we would expect recurring invoices to happen. And again, in that context, we don't really want to report those. What we need to do is to identify the specifics that flag those as being recurring and expected, and exclude those from any exceptions that are reported. Criteria.
Yeah, so when you look at those exceptions, those are things like you might decide to perhaps exclude intercompany invoices because it may not be very relevant from a real risk or performance point of view. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
That's absolutely right. So normally you'd be looking at the external vendors, again, where it's significant in terms of impact on the business, and intercompany tends to be less of a priority in that respect. So again, an example of what the criteria may look like and how that may be implemented. So now, moving on to exceptions and root causes. So we've walked through, fairly rapidly, 3 examples. But how can we communicate that information such that decisions can be made? First of all, at an exception by exception basis. So here we're seeing the purchase order IDs where there are non-standard payment terms with some top-level information about that, about those particular exceptions. And then we can drill down. Well, what's important here, to have here is the surrounding context, such that we can research the exception a little more, understand the context, the connected things such as vendors, maybe other related purchase orders, so that we get fuller understanding and are able to make a decision and decide on what action needs to be taken there.
I think that's a really good point, Steve, because this, with continuous monitoring, when you're looking at transactions across the business, we're not really so interested in the individual exceptions. What we're trying to do is classify them into cases and understand what the root cause for those are, so we can fix the root cause rather than just try and deal with the individual exceptions. And I think that's certainly best practice.
And that's typically where you would start. So rather than looking at individual exceptions, you may look at trends across the organisation. So what are the patterns here? So what part of the organisation does this occur more than others? Let's understand that. And what we're seeing on the screen here is non-standard payment terms across the organisation by organisational unit. And what we'd look to do is understand the peaks and get those peaks down, focus on those. Why is that happening? Are there specific circumstances why the frequency and the value is so much greater within those areas? And this type of broader perspective is key and significant in terms of input to decide where to prioritize and focus efforts, where the management attention should be focused. So to start with the broader picture, let's understand the trends, the patterns. Another example here, again, a selection of key risk indicators, or key performance indicators, looking at the four regions against those exceptions. So where is each exception occurring, and what's the frequency? Again, we can focus efforts accordingly. So once we have identified the exceptions, the next thing is to work out what the root causes are and take any action. So potentially, what are those actions? So firstly, it is an exception, let's say, and potentially, having reviewed, it indicates some kind of failure of the process or the control. So if that is the case, then we would review that process, policy, maybe some training is needed, such that we address the risk, and then continue to monitor. Secondly, it may be an exception, and it's some indication that there's some inappropriate activity occurring. So in that case, remedial action of some sort would be needed, and again, we would continue to monitor. It could be that it's human error. If that's the case, then we need to, again, look at maybe there's some integrity checks that could be added to reduce the chances of human error. Maybe there's some training needs. And finally, it's not a material exception. Yes, it's been highlighted, but there's some reason for it, some good reason, and we need to review the exception and exclusion criteria such that we don't report that going forward. And that's part of the iterative learning process of going through the exceptions. Okay, last slide for me. Summary of best practices. Don't intend to go through, talk through all of these. Just to pick on one or two. First of all, don't assume. We've been involved in lots of conversations where we're told that simply cannot happen. Our systems have the controls in place to stop that happening. But many times when we've done a quick scan type exercise, we've actually found transactions where it does happen. And there's been some local change made or some other factor that hadn't been considered that means that the control is not actually working as expected. And finally, the last point on here, exception to the basis of continuous improvement. So the processes and the systems are designed and implemented. People are trained to use the process, to use the systems. And what we're doing here is monitoring for the significant deviations. And the information that comes from that can feed back into the continuous improvement cycle. And with that, I'll hand back to Dan.
Thanks very much, Steve. Very interesting tour through the continuous monitoring journey. So from what Steve's shown us, there's a bit of complexity, but it's easy, right? It's pretty obvious. I mean, the examples we've shown have been pretty classic standard accounting examples, so that pretty relevant to every business, but obviously these things can apply to banking, insurance, or pharmaceuticals, or whatever business you're in. But in terms of how easy it is, I think it's always worth bearing in mind, well, first of all, it's worth bearing in mind that I never miss an opportunity to share a cheesy cartoon. But I love this cartoon. It's as I say, it's a bit of a cheap jibe of project and program management, but the issue with continuous monitoring, it is easy sometimes for people to lose track of the goal. We need a clear business goal. We need to maintain focus on it throughout, both through engaging with stakeholders and by keeping our focus on what we agreed to do. So this little cartoon, I'm sure you've all seen it before. The top left starts with what the stakeholder wanted, what they said they wanted, and goes through the litany of disasters as various people put their spin on it, and ends up with something pretty hopeless. So I think that can apply to lots of things, and it can certainly apply to continuous monitoring. So the critical success factor there is keep a razor-sharp focus on the business goal we set out to achieve. But obviously, Steve indicated some of the techniques and some of the approaches, and a lot of that seems fairly straightforward. I think one of the critical elements is there is a balanced set of skills required, and there's probably three classifications. To do this well, to do it sustainably and on a continuous basis and deliver value, you need obviously somebody or people involved in the process who really understand the business processes and are able to analyze and understand the impact of exceptions in those business processes, understand how to facilitate discussion around risk and performance, and be able to go down both those avenues and come up with a discussion to help prioritize what are the key focus areas. And then you've got the need for people, or somebody with data and system process knowledge. Somebody who understands how the process is embedded in the systems. And then you've obviously got technical skills, people who know how to do the technical data filtering and smart filtering and analysis, understand the technologies involved, and some logical design for business rules and understanding business analysis of exceptions. And then getting down with the stakeholders to root cause analysis and trying to classify what are the critical things we need to focus attention on so we can drive an effective continuous improvement process. So, critical success factors, we talked about keeping a focus on the goal. I think what we've seen so far is, when we've looked through the continuous monitoring examples, obviously risk, monitoring for risk exposure is important and getting a lot of focus these days. Monitoring for performance improvement, finding those gaps in performance which can help drive continuous improvement. And obviously there's always requirements for monitoring for control and compliance, either for audit or for external regulation. That's always required. And even at that level, you can probably, if your organization is involved at all in the more mundane element of controls of segregation of duties, you will know that compensating controls or mitigating controls for unresolved segregation of duties requires some way of finding the specific transactions which, and the specific data which indicates a conflict. So you can then look at and validate that there's nothing untoward being done. Key point here is continuous monitoring is getting a lot more attention. I think the audit committee and the board are much more aware of this than they were before. Risk, compliance, finance, and of course the external communities. I do think it's important. We have a lot of discussions where this becomes a strategic discussion, and you have to be careful. That, to me, that euphemism of that is slow and costly. This is not an IT strategy. It's a strategy for performance improvement in the business, whether it's in finance or operations or procurement or whatever. We sometimes ask, how is it we manage the exceptions? And I think your key management, your key process owners around the organization, this should already be a key focus for them. And I think it's very important to drive rapid results early and avoid the stagnant debate. And part of that is monitor what matters. And the simple question is, if I don't know what decision I'll make if we find an exception, then it's not very important. So if you're going to get on the road to continuous monitoring, you've got to start somewhere. So you've got to do a one-off monitoring before you can become continuous. And so this is the quick scan concept has got a lot of attention. And this is basically all the concepts Steve's described, but in a one-off focus for a particular process, agreed set of risk or performance themes, for a particular organizational segment to drive that analysis across 100% of the transactions and data, to get the exceptions, stimulate that discussion, drive some value, and then use that to work out whether there's more to be done in the standardization and simplification, or whether that's sufficient to do on an ad hoc basis. So that was our agenda. We're nearly up to 45 minutes, so you can recall that agenda. Questions. We have a number of questions on the panel. We're probably going to get to one, if not two. If you have any questions you haven't asked, feel free to email either Steve or myself. If you're interested in our observations generally on this topic, you can see that blog there. I will just take the first question off the list from those who've entered. How do you identify the specific exceptions to look for? Very good question. That's pretty critical. So I think we said earlier on, if you're going down this route and you have no idea what exceptions you're looking for, basically there's an issue where you haven't really got a stakeholder and owner yet. The key stakeholders need to be process owners, either central or regional or local, and they have to have a specific concern around a risk area, a process, or a KPI that needs optimizing. And the kind of questions you've got to ask are, what can go wrong with this process? Alternatively, what must go right for us to operate at peak performance? What is the biggest payoff for standardization? These are the kind of questions you want to ask, which drive out the themes that then you can get down to the detail of what we monitor for. I am aware that our 45 minutes is up. We will respond to your other questions directly. Thank you very much for your attendance, and I hope you found it useful. It has been a deeper dive, and thanks very much.